He cleans the floors, but has never told a soul what he's seen or done, Thomas Reeves whispered, his weathered hands gripping the mop handle with the same precision they once held instruments of war. He moved silently through the polished corridors of the FBI's Philadelphia field office, a shadow in grey maintenance coveralls, all but invisible to the agents hurrying past with their badges and ambitions. The faded tattoo on his forearm, a dagger piercing a delta symbol, remained carefully hidden beneath his long sleeve, a remnant of a classified past he believed was buried forever. Then Special Agent Katherine Morrison, newly transferred from the Pentagon's Joint Special Operations Command, saw the tattoo when his sleeve rode up as he reached to change a light bulb. She stopped mid-sentence, her conversation forgotten, her eyes locked onto the faded ink on Thomas's arm. The agent stood frozen, her face a mask of stunned disbelief. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Thomas Reeves had perfected the art of invisibility long before he ever donned the janitor's uniform. At 58, his once imposing frame had grown leaner but no less powerful, a coiled strength disguised beneath unassuming clothes and deliberate movements designed not to draw attention. His close-cropped salt-and-pepper hair and neatly trimmed beard gave him the appearance of countless aging blue-collar workers across America, exactly as he intended. For 7 years, he had worked the evening shift at the Philadelphia FBI field office, arriving precisely at 4 p.m. and departing at midnight, moving through the building with the quiet efficiency that had once been his professional hallmark in very different circumstances. He knew every corner of the 6-story building, every agent's habits, which trash cans filled fastest, which bathrooms required the most attention after a busy day of interviews and interrogations. The agents barely noticed him, a ghost with a mop, a nameless fixture of their environment. Thomas preferred it that way. His small apartment in North Philly wasn't much, but it was clean and paid for. His routine was simple. Morning runs regardless of weather, breakfast at the same diner where they knew to have black coffee waiting, afternoons spent reading military history or tending to the small collection of resilient plants on his balcony. Then work. The weekends brought volunteer shifts at the VA hospital, though none of the veterans there knew exactly what Thomas had done during his 22 years of service. Only his personnel file knew that, and it remained heavily redacted, buried in classified archives. The tattoo had been a youthful indiscretion, acquired after his selection to the unit that officially didn't exist. The Army frowned upon such identifying marks, but in the Brotherhood of Operators, certain traditions persisted beneath the radar. Now, it was just another scar among many, a faded reminder of a life that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. "Mr. Reeves, could you take care of the conference room on 4? There was a briefing that ran late," called Marjorie from the security desk as Thomas signed in for his shift, his weathered hands dwarfing the pen as he scrawled his signature. "On it, Marge," he replied, with the slight nod that constituted most of his daily communication. Marjorie, a retired Philadelphia PD dispatcher who had known Thomas since his first day, was perhaps the closest thing he had to a friend within these walls. She had long ago stopped trying to engage him in extended conversation, respecting the quiet dignity he carried like an invisible shield. "Supposed to storm tonight," she added. "Drive safe, heading home." Thomas nodded again, appreciating her concern without needing to express it. He collected his cart from the maintenance closet, checking his supplies with the same methodical attention to detail that had once been applied to equipment that cost millions and saved lives, or took them. Every tool in its place, every cleaner, properly diluted, every rag folded with precision, small disciplines preserved from another life. The Philadelphia field office buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. It was Wednesday, and Wednesdays always brought the counter-terrorism briefings, which meant the fourth-floor conference room would be littered with coffee cups and discarded briefing materials, some of which Thomas wasn't technically cleared to see anymore. The agents were usually careful about sensitive documents, but they grew careless around someone they perceived as part of the furniture. Thomas had seen classified material left in plain sight dozens of times over the years. He never looked. Twice, never mentioned it, simply moved things aside to clean and moved on. Some habits were too deeply ingrained to break, including operational security and the protection of information. His discretion was something the agents took for granted, never knowing it had been forged in environments where indiscretion meant death. The elevator hummed as it carried him to the fourth floor, the cart's wheels squeaking slightly on the right side. He'd been meaning to apply some lubricant to the bearing, but hadn't gotten around to it. Small irritations like this would have been unacceptable in his former life, where equipment maintenance could mean the difference between a successful extraction or bodies left behind enemy lines. The fourth floor was quieter than the bustling entry level, with most agents having departed for the day. A few lights still burned in offices along the corridor as Thomas made his way to the main conference room. The door was ajar, and he could hear voices inside, indicating the meeting had indeed run long. He paused outside, waiting patiently. Thomas never interrupted. Years of stalking targets across multiple continents had taught him the virtue of patience, of waiting for the perfect moment rather than forcing an entry. He stood silently, his presence barely registering to a passing agent who nodded absently in his direction. Inside the conference room, the voices grew louder, more animated. Something about a developing situation, surveillance protocols, interagency cooperation. Thomas didn't listen intentionally, but his trained ear automatically sorted the information, a reflex from decades of intelligence gathering. "We need someone who understands how these groups operate from the inside," a woman's voice said firmly. "The conventional approach isn't working, and we're running out of time before this cell goes operational." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "The Bureau has plenty of experienced counter-terrorism agents," a male voice countered, defensive. "With all due respect, Agent Hargrove, understanding terrorist methodology from a textbook is not the same as having faced it in the field. I've worked with the special operations community, and their perspective is invaluable in these scenarios." Thomas recognized the edge in the woman's voice, the frustration of specialized knowledge being dismissed by bureaucratic thinking. He'd heard it countless times in briefing rooms far from American soil, usually right before his unit was called in to clean up a situation gone sideways. The door swung open suddenly, and a group of agents filed out. Thomas stepped back respectfully, his eyes downcast, cart positioned to one side of the hallway to allow them passage. Most walked past without a glance, engaged in continued debate or checking phones for missed calls. The dismissal was so complete it was almost comical to someone who had once commanded attention in rooms filled with generals and intelligence directors. Only one person slowed, the woman whose voice he had heard advocating for special operations experience. She was tall and athletic, with dark hair pulled back severely from a face that suggested both intelligence and determination. Her navy blue suit was impeccably tailored, but chosen for functionality rather than fashion. Her ID badge identified her as Special Agent Katherine Morrison. Her eyes met his briefly, with the uncommon courtesy of actually seeing the person in the maintenance uniform. Thomas nodded politely and waited for her to pass before entering the conference room. The aftermath of the meeting was typical: half-empty coffee cups, scattered papers, chairs askew. Thomas worked methodically, starting with the trash. Then, wiping down the massive conference table, erasing the whiteboard covered with operational timelines and surveillance photos of bearded men outside nondescript buildings. He was reaching up to change a flickering fluorescent tube when he heard someone enter behind him. Years of training made him aware of the presence without needing to turn. The footsteps were deliberate, someone returning for something forgotten, not the casual stride of another maintenance worker. "Excuse me," came the voice he recognized as Agent Morrison's. "I think I left my—" Thomas turned slightly, balanced on the small stepladder, his right arm extended upward to remove the defective light tube. The movement caused his uniform sleeve to ride up just enough to reveal 3 inches of forearm, and the edge of the faded tattoo, a stylized dagger piercing through a delta symbol, with 3 small stars beneath it, an unofficial marking known only to those who had served in a very particular capacity. The sudden silence was profound. Thomas looked down to see Agent Morrison staring at his exposed forearm. Her eyes widened in recognition, her sentence abandoned mid-thought. He quickly lowered his arm, tugging the sleeve down in a casual movement that nonetheless confirmed he was aware of what she had seen. "I just need to grab my notes," she said after a beat, her voice carefully modulated to sound normal, while her eyes remained fixed on him with new intensity. Thomas nodded and stepped down from the ladder, moving aside to give her space. He returned to wiping down the table, his movements no different than they had been a moment before, though he was acutely aware that everything had changed. For the first time in 7 years, someone in this building had seen beyond the janitor's uniform. Agent Morrison collected a leather portfolio from the far end of the conference table, but made no move to leave. Instead, she watched him work for a moment, her professional training warring with obvious curiosity. "You have an interesting tattoo," she said finally, her tone conversational but weighted with meaning. "Just an old military thing," Thomas replied, his voice rough from limited use, giving nothing away. "I worked liaison with JSOC for 3 years before transferring here," she continued, undeterred. "That's not just any military tattoo." Thomas straightened, meeting her gaze directly for the first time. His eyes, a pale grey that had once been described by a teammate as winter sky before a snowstorm, assessed her with a thoroughness that belonged to his former life, not his current one. "Was there something else you needed, Agent Morrison?" he asked quietly. The use of her name without introduction registered immediately. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she recovered quickly. "How long have you worked here, Mr. Reeves?" "Thomas Reeves, 7 years this August. And before that," Thomas resumed cleaning, his movements economical and precise. "Army, retired." "Which unit?" she pressed, setting her portfolio down again. "That information isn't relevant to keeping these floors clean, ma'am." The ma'am was neither deferential nor disrespectful, simply the ingrained address of a military man. Agent Morrison leaned against the conference table, arms crossed, studying him with undisguised interest. "You know, we're facing a situation with a domestic terror cell with overseas training. The kind of situation where someone with specialized experience might have valuable insights." Thomas met her gaze again, his expression neutral. "I'm sure the Bureau has plenty of qualified analysts for that." "We do," she agreed. "But sometimes there's no substitute for someone who's been in the room when these operations are planned from the other side. Someone who understands the mindset, the training methods, the weaknesses." Thomas finished wiping the table and gathered, "His supplies. If you'll excuse me, Agent Morrison, I have 3 more floors to complete tonight." She straightened, respecting his clear desire to end the conversation, but reached into her jacket pocket and extracted a business card. "If you ever want to discuss old tattoos or anything else, my door is always open. Office 422. Thomas took the card reflexively, years of ingrained politeness overriding his reluctance. He slipped it into his pocket without looking at it. Have a good evening, Agent Morrison. You too, Mr. Reeves. She moved toward the door, then paused. You know, talents shouldn't go to waste, regardless of what uniform they're wrapped in these days. With that, she was gone, leaving Thomas alone with the hum of the air conditioning and the subtle shift in his carefully constructed world. He finished changing the light tube, his movements automatic, while his mind processed the encounter with the precision that had once made him exceptional at work few would ever know about. As he pushed his cart toward the elevator, he was aware of a sensation he hadn't experienced in years, the feeling of being seen, not as maintenance staff, not as background furniture in the daily drama of federal law enforcement, but as who he had once been. It was uncomfortable, like a spotlight. Finding someone accustomed to operating in shadows, Thomas completed his shift with the same thoroughness he always did, but his mind kept returning to the encounter, to Agent Morrison's card sitting in his pocket like a small burning coal. By the time he signed out at midnight, the storm Marjorie had predicted was in full force, sheets of rain pounding the parking lot as he made his way to his aging Jeep Cherokee. The drive home through Philadelphia's rain-slicked streets was automatic, muscle memory guiding him while his thoughts remained on the implications of being recognized. His carefully constructed anonymity had been a choice, a deliberate withdrawal from a world that had taken more from him than most would ever understand. The quiet routine of his current life had been hard-won, a peace built on the absence of the adrenaline and consequence that had defined his existence for over 2 decades. His apartment welcomed him with its familiar simplicity, a space devoid of personal photographs or mementos, containing only functional furniture, a wall of bookshelves, and the few possessions he deemed necessary. No medals hung on these walls, no shadow boxes preserved the insignia of units that officially never existed, no photographs captured the faces of men he had fought alongside across the world's most dangerous regions. Thomas hung his damp jacket by the door and moved to the kitchen, filling a kettle for tea, a habit acquired during long deployments with British Special Forces. As the water heated, he removed Agent Morrison's card from his pocket, studying it properly for the first time. The card was standard FBI issue, name, title, contact information. Nothing remarkable except for what it represented, an intersection between his past and present that he had never anticipated. He propped it against the kettle and stared at it while steam began to rise. The rain intensified outside, drumming against the windows in a rhythm that had once signaled optimal conditions for certain operations. Thomas prepared his tea and moved to the living room, settling into his worn leather reading chair. Instead of reaching for the book he'd been working through, a history of the Byzantine Empire, he found himself staring at the blank wall opposite, seeing not plaster, but memories he normally kept carefully compartmentalized. Kabul, 2002, Mosul, 2004, Somalia, 2007, Colombia, 2010. Places and dates that marked operations the public would never know about, actions that had shaped global events from the shadows, faces of teammates, some now dead, others scattered to the winds of retirement, and private contracting, the weight of decisions made in seconds that had determined who lived and who died. Thomas sipped his tea, allowing the memories to surface fully for the first time in years. Recognition, he realized, had cracked the seal on a vault he had deliberately closed. The question now was whether to reseal it or to open it further. The card sat on the side table beside him, a small rectangle of possibility. Thomas finished his tea, set the empty cup aside, and made his decision. At precisely 5:30 the next morning, Thomas laced up his running shoes and headed out into the pre-dawn streets of Philadelphia, the storm having passed to leave behind puddles that reflected the streetlights in broken patterns. His 5-mile route never varied, down to the river, along the path that paralleled the water, then back through the awakening city. Running had been part of his life for so long that his body fell into the rhythm without conscious thought, leaving his mind free to process. By the time he returned to his apartment, showered, and dressed for his Thursday routine, he had formulated his approach to the disruption Agent Morrison represented. At the diner, his coffee was waiting at his usual corner booth. Thomas nodded. His thanks to Doris, the long-time waitress who had given up trying to engage him in conversation years ago, but maintained a friendly silence as she delivered his standard breakfast of 2 eggs, over easy, wheat toast and sliced tomatoes instead of potatoes. "Supposed to be a nice day after all that rain," she offered, refilling his coffee without being asked. "Good day to dry out," Thomas agreed, one of his longer conversational contributions. Doris seemed pleased by the response, lingering a moment, longer than usual. "You ever think about switching up your order, Thomas? We got a special on blueberry pancakes today." The question was innocent, but it struck Thomas as oddly parallel to the disruption already occurring in his life. Change. One established pattern, and others might follow. "Maybe tomorrow," he heard himself say, surprising both Doris and himself. She smiled, a warm expression that suggested she saw more in this small concession than was immediately apparent. "I'll hold you to that." Thomas ate methodically, his mind still working through contingencies and approaches. By the time he paid his bill and left his usual generous but not extravagant tip, he had settled on his course of action. Instead of heading directly home to his books and plants, Thomas took a detour, driving to a storage facility on the outskirts of the city. Unit 227 contained the only physical connections to his former life, a military footlocker secured with a combination lock whose sequence came to his fingers without conscious thought. The unit was climate-controlled and meticulously organized. Like everything in Thomas's life, he located the footlocker quickly, knelt before it, and dialed the combination. The lock opened with a satisfying click. Inside, preserved in sealed containers and organized by year, lay the remnants of a life lived in the shadows of American foreign policy. Photographs, documents, a few carefully selected items that held personal significance, all kept not out of sentimentality, but from a soldier's instinct to maintain records of battles fought and lessons learned. Thomas extracted a particular sealed envelope, verified its contents without removing them, and resealed the footlocker. Whatever decision he made regarding Agent Morrison's implied invitation, it would be made with clear understanding of the potential consequences. Back in his apartment, Thomas placed the envelope in a drawer of his simple desk and went about his afternoon routine. At 3:15, he changed into his maintenance uniform, the grey coveralls as familiar to him now as battle dress uniforms had once been. At 3:45, he left for work, arriving at the FBI building with his customary punctuality. Marjorie greeted him with a friendly nod as he signed in. "Agent Morrison was asking about you earlier," she mentioned, her tone casual but her eyes curious. Thomas's expression didn't change. "Oh?" "Said she had a maintenance request for her office. I told her you'd be in at 4. Marjorie had worked security long enough to recognize unusual interest in another staff member, but professional discretion kept her from asking the obvious questions. "I'll check with her," Thomas replied, his voice giving nothing away. His maintenance cart was where he had left it, everything in its precise place. Thomas added the supplies he would need for the evening shift and made his way to the elevator, 4th floor. Room 422. He had memorized Agent Morrison's card without needing to look at it again. The upper floors were quieter than usual for a Thursday, with many agents likely in the field or attending interagency meetings. Thomas moved through the corridors with his habitual silence, noting the occupied offices, the patterns of activity, the security protocols in action. All unconscious observations from training never forgotten. Office 422 had its door ajar, light spilling into the hallway. Thomas paused outside, cart positioned at a respectful distance, and knocked lightly on the doorframe. Agent Morrison looked up from her computer, her expression shifting from concentration to recognition. "Mr. Reeves," she said, gesturing him inside. "Thank you for coming by." Thomas entered, but remained standing near the door, maintaining a professional distance. Marjorie mentioned a maintenance request. Agent Morrison rose from her desk and closed the door behind him, a move that would have triggered Thomas's threat assessment in another life, but now merely confirmed his suspicions about this meeting. "No maintenance issue," she admitted. "I wanted to continue our conversation from yesterday, if you're willing." Thomas remained still, his posture neither defensive nor particularly open. "What exactly do you think we have to discuss, Agent Morrison?" She leaned against her desk, arms crossed in a deliberately casual posture designed to put him at ease. It was a technique Thomas recognized. He had used similar approaches when handling assets in the field. "I think we have quite a lot to discuss, Master Sergeant Reeves. Or should I say, Sergeant Major? Your service record becomes rather opaque after 2005. The use of his former rank was deliberate, a signal that she had done her research in the hours since their encounter. Thomas felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the automatic response to potential threat that had kept him alive across 4 continents. "You've been busy," he observed neutrally. "I'm good at my job," she replied without arrogance. "Though not as good as you apparently were at yours." Thomas glanced around her office, noting the familiar signs of a dedicated agent. Case files stacked in organized piles, a board with surveillance photos and timelines similar to the one he had seen in the conference room, a small refrigerator likely containing meals forgotten during long hours. "What exactly do you want, Agent Morrison?" She straightened, dropping the casual demeanor. "I want your help, off the books and unofficial. The terror cell I mentioned yesterday, they're employing tactics that suggest training by former Special Operations personnel, possibly from Eastern Europe. Their operational security is exceptional, their planning methodical. We've been tracking them for months, but we're missing something critical. And you think a janitor might have insight your counter-terrorism experts don't?" The question held no sarcasm, merely an invitation for clarification. "I think a former Delta Force operator with multiple combat deployments and specialized training in counter-terrorism might see patterns that traditional agents miss." She held his gaze. "We're not looking for official consultation or testimony, just a different perspective from someone who understands how these types of operatives think and plan." Thomas remained silent for a long moment, weighing options and implications with the measured calculation that had once been his professional hallmark. "Why me? There are plenty of former operators working as contractors or consultants." "Because you're here. Because you've been invisible in plain sight for 7 years, which suggests exceptional discipline and perspective. And because you chose to work in an FBI building rather than disappear completely, which tells me something about your fundamental values." Thomas felt an unexpected twinge of respect for Agent Morrison's assessment. Few people had ever read him so accurately, especially after he had worked so diligently to become unreadable. He remained silent, neither confirming nor denying her observations, but his lack of immediate refusal spoke volumes. "I don't do that work anymore," he said. Finally, his voice deliberately measured. "There are reasons I carry a mop instead of a weapon these days." Morrison nodded, accepting his statement without challenge. "I understand walking away. Many operators do after enough deployments. The toll is substantial." She turned toward her caseboard, gesturing to the surveillance photos. "But these people are planning something significant on American soil. The intelligence suggests multiple targets, civilian casualties potentially in the hundreds. Thomas didn't follow her gesture, keeping his eyes firmly on her rather than allowing himself to be drawn into the details of her case. Engagement, even passive, was a form of commitment he wasn't prepared to make. The Bureau has resources, interagency cooperation, technologies we couldn't have imagined when I was active, Thomas countered. A retired operator's perspective isn't going to make the difference you're suggesting. Morrison turned back to face him, her expression suddenly stripped of professional distance, revealing genuine concern. 3 weeks ago, we lost an undercover agent who had infiltrated the periphery of this group. Martin Diaz, 34, former Marine, 2 young kids, the way they found him out and what they did to him afterward. She paused, regaining her composure. It wasn't random, it was methodical, professional. They have counter-surveillance training that's allowing them to identify our people and our methods. The mention of a fallen agent shifted something in Thomas's expression, a micro-movement around the eyes that would have been imperceptible to most observers but registered clearly with Morrison. She had intentionally personalized the abstract threat, knowing from his file that protection of team members had been a core value throughout his military career. "I'm sorry about your agent," Thomas said, genuine empathy evident despite his restraint. "But inserting myself into your investigation creates complications neither of us wants. What I want is to prevent American deaths," Morrison replied firmly. "I'm willing to accept quite a few complications to accomplish that." Thomas looked away for the first time, his gaze settling on the caseboard despite his earlier determination to avoid engagement. The photographs showed surveillance images of men moving equipment into nondescript buildings, meeting in public places with studied casualness, conducting what appeared to be counter-surveillance protocols that he recognized all too well. "What exactly are you asking for?" he asked finally, his voice noticeably lower. Morrison recognized the shift immediately, not commitment, but willingness to hear more. She moved to her computer, tapped a few keys, and turned the screen toward him. 2 hours of your time, looking at surveillance footage and intelligence assessments, no official involvement, no record of consultation, just your eyes on material. Most people wouldn't know how to properly interpret. On the screen, security camera footage showed a man in a workman's uniform entering a government building, moving with a purposefulness that might seem ordinary to untrained observers, but set off immediate alarms in Thomas's mind. The man's awareness of camera positions, his deliberately averting his face at precise moments, the way he created natural opportunities to observe security protocols. It was textbook infiltration technique. "He's conducting pre-operational reconnaissance," Thomas said automatically, the assessment emerging before he could check himself. Morrison nodded, a hint of satisfaction in her expression. "That's what I thought too. Most of our analysts classified it as routine maintenance activity." Thomas stepped back from the screen, mentally re-establishing the boundary he had just inadvertently crossed. "Agent Morrison, I appreciate the seriousness of your situation, but my involvement could compromise aspects of national security that remain classified." "We've considered that," she replied. "Any insights you provide would be attributed to analytical algorithms and confidential informants. Your name never appears in any report." Thomas studied her with renewed intensity. "We've considered that suggests this invitation isn't your independent initiative." Morrison met his gaze directly. "My section chief is aware of my intention to consult with you, no one else." "And how exactly did your section chief become aware of a janitor's potential value to a counter-terrorism investigation?" "Because Section Chief Hargrove served with naval intelligence during Operation Gothic. Serpent. He recognized your name when I mentioned it. said he'd been in briefings where your team was discussed, though never officially acknowledged. The reference to the Somalia operation, the disastrous Battle of Mogadishu that most Americans knew only through a Hollywood film, was another calculated move on Morrison's part. It established her superior's understanding of the shadows Thomas had operated within and created a bridge between his past and her present needs. Thomas remained silent for a long moment, the weight of competing principles evident in his carefully controlled expression. Finally, he stepped toward the door. "I need to finish my rounds. I have responsibilities." Morrison nodded, accepting his withdrawal without protest. "The offer remains open. 2 hours, completely off the record." Thomas paused at the threshold. "I'll consider it." He left without further comment, returning to his maintenance cart and continuing his evening routine with the same methodical attention he always demonstrated. Yet inside, calculations and assessments were running at a pace he hadn't experienced in years. Operational security concerns, potential value of his insights balanced against the risks of re-engagement, the moral weight of potentially preventable civilian casualties. By the time he finished his shift at midnight, Thomas had reached a decision, though it sat uncomfortably against the careful isolation he had constructed for himself over 7 years of deliberate disengagement. The next morning broke clear and warm, a perfect late spring day that found Thomas at his usual diner booth earlier than normal. He had slept poorly, his dreams infiltrated by images from active deployments he had long ago locked away in the disciplined compartments of his mind. "Blueberry pancakes," he said, when Doris approached with her coffee pot, remembering yesterday's conversation. Her surprise was evident. "Well, now, that's a change. Special occasion." "Just trying something different," Thomas replied, offering a small smile that seemed to please her immensely. As he ate, Thomas observed the other patrons with renewed attention. The retired couple who always took the window booth, the young medical residents from the nearby hospital ending their overnight shifts, the businesswoman who ate while simultaneously conducting conference calls. For 7 years, he had registered these people as background, potential threats assessed and dismissed. Today, he saw them as what they truly were, the civilians he had spent his career protecting, often from threats they never knew existed. After breakfast, Thomas drove not to his apartment, but to a public park near the river. He parked his jeep and walked to a bench positioned to provide maximum situational awareness, clear sightlines in all directions, multiple potential exit routes, minimal vulnerability to observation. Old habits. From his jacket pocket, he removed the envelope, retrieved from his storage unit. Inside were photographs, all taken on the same day in eastern Afghanistan, 2011. They showed Thomas with his team, 8 men in full combat gear, faces partially obscured by desert camouflage and protective equipment, standing before a captured weapons cache that had been destined for Taliban fighters in the region. The photographs themselves weren't classified. They had been taken with personal cameras rather than for official documentation. What made them significant was what had happened 3 days after they were taken. 6 of the 8 men pictured had been killed when their helicopter was shot down during extraction from a subsequent mission. Thomas and one other operator had been in a different aircraft that managed to evade enemy fire. Thomas studied the faces of his fallen teammates, men whose names were engraved on a memorial wall, but whose operations remained classified, whose families had received the sanitized version of their deaths rather than the complex, often morally ambiguous reality of their work. He had survived when they hadn't, the random fortune of helicopter assignment that had haunted him through the remaining years of his service and into retirement. The decision to walk away had come shortly thereafter. Not officially, he had served 3 more years, fulfilling his commitment, but internally the mission had lost its clarity. Thomas had completed his assigned operations with the same technical excellence as always, but the sense of purpose that had sustained him through 2 decades of sacrifice had dimmed to barely a flicker. He returned the photographs to the envelope and sat watching the river for nearly an hour, his mind cycling through operations in a dozen countries, intelligence assessments of terrorist capabilities, the evolving tactics he had observed across his career, and how those insights might apply to Agent Morrison's current threat. By the time Thomas left the park, his decision was made. At 3 p.m., 90 minutes before his shift was scheduled to begin, Thomas entered the FBI building through the main entrance rather than the service access he typically used. He was dressed not in his maintenance uniform, but in simple civilian clothes, dark jeans, a blue button-down shirt, and a leather jacket that had seen years of wear. "Mr. Reeves," Marjorie's surprise at the security desk was evident. "You're early today, and out of uniform." "Personal matter," Thomas explained briefly. "I've been asked to meet with Agent Morrison before my shift." Marjorie's expression suggested curiosity, but her professionalism prevailed. "I'll need to issue you a different visitor badge, since you're not in work capacity." She processed his ID and handed him a visitor badge rather than his usual maintenance credentials. "4th floor, right?" Thomas nodded, clipping the badge to his jacket pocket. "Thank you, Marjorie." The elevator felt different when entered as a visitor rather than staff, a subtle psychological shift that Thomas noted with the self-awareness that had been drilled into him through years of specialized training. Perception shaped reality, and already he was being perceived differently simply by changing his clothing and time of arrival. Agent Morrison's surprise was evident when she opened her office door to his knock. "Mr. Reeves, I wasn't expecting you until—" "You asked for 2 hours," Thomas interrupted quietly. "I'm here to provide them before my shift begins." She recovered quickly, gesturing him inside. "Of course. Thank you for coming." She closed the door behind him and moved to her computer. "I've prepared the materials I think would be most valuable for you to review." "Before we begin," Thomas said, remaining standing, "I need to establish parameters. I'll review your materials and provide general observations based on my training and experience. I won't disclose classified tactics or operations. I won't confirm or deny my involvement in any specific mission, and this consultation never happened." Morrison nodded, accepting his terms without hesitation. "Agreed on all points." "And this is a one-time event," Thomas added firmly, "not the beginning of an ongoing consultation." At this, Morrison hesitated briefly before nodding again. "Understood." For the next 2 hours, Thomas reviewed surveillance footage, intelligence reports, and pattern analyses compiled by the FBI's Counter-Terrorism Division. He said little at first, absorbing the information with the practiced focus that had once made him exceptional at connecting disparate intelligence fragments into actionable conclusions. The terror cell consisted of 8 identified members with suspected connections to at least 4 others. Their activities suggested a level of training and operational security that immediately confirmed Morrison's assessment. These weren't self-radicalized amateurs, but professionally trained operatives with specific objectives and methodical planning protocols. "They're compartmentalizing information," Thomas observed, pointing to patterns in their meeting structures. "These 3 only meet with this individual, never with each other or the remaining members. It's a cell structure designed to ensure that captured operatives can only compromise a limited portion of the operation." Morrison nodded, taking notes. "That's what we suspected, but the pattern wasn't clear enough to be definitive." Thomas continued his analysis, identifying surveillance detection routes, communications security measures, and equipment procurement patterns that pointed to specific types of planned operations. As he worked, the years of retirement seemed to fall away, his mind engaging with the familiar challenge of threat assessment and counter-strategy development. "They're planning something with these 3 buildings," he said finally, pointing to surveillance images of federal facilities. "The pattern of reconnaissance is too specific, too thorough. But these are decoys." He indicated 2 other locations. "They've been surveilled too obviously, with methods easily detected by your standard security protocols. It's misdirection." Morrison leaned forward, intensity evident in her posture. "How can you be certain?" "Because it's what I would have done," Thomas replied simply. "Create obvious interest in secondary targets to draw security resources away from the primary objective." "And what do you think the primary objective is?" Thomas studied the map where the locations were marked, considering patterns of population density, symbolic value, and potential impact. "Without more intelligence, I can't be certain, but based on their movements and the equipment they've been accumulating, I'd focus attention here." He indicated an area that hadn't been highlighted in the FBI's assessment. Morrison stared at the location, then at Thomas. "The Federal Reserve Branch. We hadn't considered it a primary target. Their operational pattern suggests they're planning for an event with maximum economic impact rather than just maximal casualties," Thomas explained. "The timing patterns of their surveillance, the specific angles they've been photographing from, they're assessing security rotation schedules and building structural vulnerabilities." For the remainder of their agreed 2 hours, Thomas continued to identify patterns and probabilities that had eluded the FBI's standard analytical approach. He didn't provide specific tactical advice or directly reference his own operational experience, but the insights clearly stemmed from decades of practical application rather than theoretical training. As their time drew to a close, Morrison reviewed her notes with evident appreciation. "This is invaluable, Mr. Reeves. You've potentially redirected our entire investigative focus." Thomas stood, glancing at his watch. "I need to change for my shift." "Of course." Morrison rose as well. "I don't know how to properly thank you." "No thanks necessary," Thomas replied, moving toward the door. "Just stop them." He paused at the threshold, turning back with a final observation. "Your agent, Diaz, the way they identified him suggests they have access to federal personnel databases or recognition technology. I'd examine potential insider threats or system breaches very carefully." Morrison's expression shifted from gratitude to renewed concern. "We've been investigating that possibility, but haven't found evidence yet." "Keep looking," Thomas said simply, then left to retrieve his maintenance uniform from his locker. 20 minutes later, he pushed his cleaning cart onto the 4th floor, once again dressed in grey coveralls, once again invisible to most of the agents he passed. The transition back to his chosen anonymity felt both familiar and strangely constraining, as if he had briefly stepped into a better-fitting suit, only to return to clothes that no longer quite matched his form. As Thomas worked through his usual cleaning routine, he found himself more aware of conversations around him, more attuned to the activities of the agents and support staff. The muscle memory of operational awareness had been reawakened during his consultation with Morrison, and now it refused to subside back into the comfortable numbness he had cultivated. Near the end of his shift, as he was emptying trash bins on the executive floor, Thomas encountered Agent Morrison in the hallway. She was walking with Section Chief Hargrove, deep in conversation about what appeared to be the revised investigative approach Thomas had suggested. They paused when they saw him, Morrison with a nod of acknowledgement, and Hargrove with a curious glance between them. "Evening," Thomas said simply, continuing with his work. "Good evening, Mr. Reeves," Morrison replied, her tone professional but her eyes conveying deeper appreciation. Hargrove's gaze lingered on Thomas with the unmistakable look of a man connecting a name from briefing documents with the living person before him. "Mr. Reeves," he acknowledged with a respectful nod before they continued down the hallway. Thomas finished his shift precisely at midnight, as always. He signed out with Marjorie, exchanged their usual brief pleasantries about the weather, and walked to his jeep in the nearly empty parking lot. Everything external remained unchanged, the routine preserved. Yet internally, something had shifted. A door cracked open that he had believed permanently sealed. As he drove home through the quiet Philadelphia streets, Thomas found himself more alert, more present than he had been in years. The tactical awareness that had been second nature throughout his operational career had reawakened, not with the hypervigilance of combat readiness, but with a clarity of perception that made the world seem suddenly more defined, more immediate. In his apartment, Thomas made his customary cup of tea, but didn't settle into his reading chair. Instead, he stood at the window overlooking the city, watching the patterns of late-night traffic, the rhythmic changing of stoplights, the occasional pedestrian hurrying home. For 7 years, he had built a life defined by its limitations, the narrow parameters of routine, the deliberate avoidance of engagement, the careful construction of invisibility. It had been a form of penance, perhaps, for surviving when others hadn't, or simply the exhausted retreat of a man who had seen too much of humanity's capacity for violence. The consultation with Morrison had awakened something he had believed dormant, not just his analytical abilities or tactical awareness, but the sense of purpose that had once defined his existence. The reminder that his hard-earned knowledge, purchased at such personal cost, might still serve to protect the innocent. Thomas sipped his tea, considering the implications of this reawakening. One consultation didn't mean a return to his former life or even regular engagement with Morrison's investigation, but it had cracked the protective shell of isolation he had built around himself, allowing in possibilities he had long ago dismissed. His phone rang, startling in the quiet apartment. Few people had his number, and fewer still would call at such an hour. The display showed an unfamiliar number with a Virginia area code, Quantico possibly, or Langley. Thomas answered with caution. "Reeves." "Mr. Reeves, this is Section Chief Hargrove," came the response, the voice crisp with urgency. "I apologize for the late call, but we've had a development based on your observations today. A surveillance team has identified unusual activity at the Federal Reserve location you flagged." Thomas felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the precursor to the focused calm that had carried him through countless high-risk operations. "I see. Agent Morrison suggested I inform you directly," Hargrove continued. "Your insights have potentially prevented a significant attack. We've mobilized tactical teams and are coordinating with Homeland Security for containment." Thank you for the update," Thomas replied, unsure what else was expected of him in this strange new territory between his past and present. Hargrove paused briefly. "There's something else, Mr. Reeves. Your background, what I know of it, suggests you might be interested in continuing to provide occasional consultation on matters where your expertise would be valuable. Strictly unofficial, of course, and with all the parameters you established with Agent Morrison." The offer hung in the air between them, unexpected and yet somehow inevitable from the moment Morrison had recognized his tattoo. Thomas looked out at the city, his city now after 7 years of quiet residence, and considered what it meant to step even partially back into a world he had deliberately left behind. "I'll need to think about that," he said finally. "Of course," Hargrove replied, For what it's worth, men with your particular skills and experience are rare, Mr. Reeves. Rarer still are those who understand how to apply them with wisdom rather than just technical proficiency. After the call ended, Thomas remained at the window, watching as dawn gradually brightened the eastern sky. The day ahead contained his usual Friday routine: running, breakfast at the diner, an afternoon volunteering at the VA, then his evening shift. But something fundamental had changed. The invisible janitor had been seen, not just by Morrison and Hargrove, but in some essential way by himself. The tattoo on his forearm, the dagger piercing the delta marked with 3 stars, had been a symbol of belonging to something greater than himself, a brotherhood forged in shared sacrifice and purpose. For years he had kept it hidden, a remnant of a life he believed finished. Now it had become a bridge between worlds, a reminder that the man he had been still existed beneath the careful anonymity he had constructed. As the first rays of sunlight touched the Philadelphia skyline, Thomas made another cup of tea and sat down at his simple desk. He opened the drawer containing the envelope of photographs, studying once more the faces of the men he had served with, the brothers lost to a war most Americans would never fully understand. For the first time in years, the grief was accompanied not just by survivors' guilt, but by a sense of continued obligation to honor their sacrifice by using what he had learned alongside them to continue their shared mission of protection. The revelation wasn't dramatic, no sudden epiphany or emotional breakdown. It was a quiet realignment, the subtle shift of a man rediscovering a core truth about himself that had been temporarily obscured but never truly erased. Thomas Reeves would continue to clean the floors of the FBI's Philadelphia field office, to maintain his modest apartment, to run his morning route along the river. But beneath the unassuming exterior, something had reawakened, a sense of purpose, a willingness to engage, a recognition that his value extended beyond the boundaries he had imposed upon himself. The janitor would remain largely invisible to most who passed him in the building's corridors. But now there were those who saw beyond the grey coveralls to the man beneath, a man whose skills and experience represented a unique resource in a world where such insights could mean the difference between safety and catastrophe. And perhaps most importantly, Thomas had begun to see himself clearly again, not just as the quiet man with a mop who blended into the background, but as someone whose hard-earned wisdom still had purpose in a world that desperately needed it. The thwarted attack on the Federal Reserve made no headlines, no breaking news alerts interrupted regular programming, no newspaper front pages celebrated the prevention of what would have been a devastating economic strike against the nation. This was by design. The operational success measured precisely by its absence from public awareness, the invisible victory of prevention rather than the visible trauma of aftermath. Thomas learned the details 2 days later, when Agent Morrison appeared beside him as he was replacing light fixtures in a third-floor conference room. 4 arrests, 2 safe houses secured, enough explosives to take down 3 city blocks, she said quietly, handing him a cup of coffee. Not the break room's standard offering, but from the upscale shop across the street. The intelligence community's unsung victory of the month. Thomas accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks, but continued working, maintaining the appearance of a maintenance man simply doing his job. "Good outcome," he replied, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry. "Beyond her. Better than good, perfect." Morrison leaned against the wall, watching him work with newfound appreciation for the precision in his movements, the economy of effort that characterized everything he did. The director himself called Hargrove to commend the team on the intelligence breakthrough. "Our section is being held up as a model for interagency coordination and analytical excellence." Thomas allowed himself a small smile as he secured the new fixture in place. "Congratulations." "The commendation belongs to you, Mr. Reeves," Your identification of the true target and insider threat vector was the key that unlocked everything else. He descended the stepladder and gathered his tools, finally meeting her gaze directly. I provided a perspective. Your team did the heavy lifting. Morrison shook her head slightly, unwilling to let him minimize his contribution. Your perspective saved lives and possibly prevented economic damage in the billions. There's no metric for calculating the value of what doesn't happen, but if there were, this would be off the charts. Thomas packed his tools methodically, the habit of order so ingrained it required no conscious thought. Was there something specific you needed, Agent Morrison? Or just delivering good news? Actually, yes. She straightened, shifting to a more professional posture. Section Chief Hargrove would like to meet with you tomorrow morning. He mentioned you've been considering his offer of occasional consultation. The invitation wasn't unexpected, but it still triggered a complex internal response, part wariness, part unexpected interest. I have my volunteer shift at the VA tomorrow morning. He's suggested 7 a.m. before your commitments, his office. Morrison handed him a small envelope. This contains temporary clearance documentation. You'll need it to access his floor without an escort. Thomas tucked the envelope into his coverall pocket without examining it. I'll be there. Morrison studied him for a moment longer, curiosity evident beneath her professional demeanor. You know, most people would have questions about the investigation results, the arrested suspects, the details of the planned operation. I'm not most people, Thomas replied simply, returning to his maintenance cart. No, Morrison agreed, with a hint of a smile. You most certainly are not. She departed with a respectful nod, leaving Thomas to continue his rounds. As he moved through the building, completing his assigned tasks with customary thoroughness, he found himself more aware of the environment around him, the agents hurrying between meetings, the support staff managing the endless flow of information, the security protocols that governed movement through the building's secure areas. For 7 years, he had observed these patterns with the detached assessment of a man determined to remain separate from them. Now, he found himself engaged in a different kind of observation, the professional analysis of operational rhythms and security vulnerabilities. At midnight, Thomas completed his shift and signed out with Marjorie, their usual brief exchange of pleasantries, a small anchor of normalcy in a week that had veered unexpectedly from his carefully constructed routine. You're looking different lately, Thomas, Marjorie observed as she logged his departure in the security system. More present, somehow. The comment startled him. Marjorie had never been one for personal observations during their years of professional courtesy. Just focusing on the job, he offered, neither confirming nor denying her assessment. She replied, clearly unconvinced, but respecting his privacy. Well, whatever it is, it suits you. The drive home through Philadelphia's quiet midnight streets gave Thomas time to process the day's developments and prepare mentally for tomorrow's meeting. 7 years of deliberate disengagement had created deep-seated habits of avoidance and detachment. Even this limited re-engagement with his former skill set had triggered a cascade of psychological adjustments, increased situational awareness, sharper observational focus, the re-emergence of analytical frameworks he had once applied to matters of national security. In his apartment, Thomas bypassed his usual evening tea ritual and instead opened the small metal lockbox he kept in his bedroom closet. Inside was a slim leather wallet containing identification documents, his official military ID card, retired, status, his VA medical card, and a special access credential issued upon his retirement that technically never expired. The credential wouldn't get him into specific facilities without updating, but it confirmed his prior clearance level and simplified the reinstatement process if ever needed. Thomas hadn't looked at these documents in years, preferring to carry only his driver's license and basic civilian identification. Now, he studied the military ID with its photo of a slightly younger but much different version of himself. Hair regulation short, expression unsmiling but alert, the bearing of a man accustomed to authority and responsibility. The contrast with his current Pennsylvania driver's license was striking. The longer hair, the deliberate neutrality of expression, the careful construction of an unremarkable identity. Two versions of the same man, separated not just by years, but by fundamental choices about engagement with the world. Thomas returned the documents to the lockbox, but didn't immediately replace it in the closet. Instead, he sat on the edge of his bed, considering what tomorrow's meeting might mean for the careful boundaries he had established between his past and present. Sleep came more easily than expected, and Thomas woke at his habitual 5 a.m. without the need for an alarm. His morning routine remained unchanged. Stretching exercises developed during his military years, a shower that remained military brief despite years of civilian life, and the selection of appropriate attire. For today's meeting, Thomas chose clothing that split the difference between his maintenance uniform and formal business wear: dark grey slacks, a navy blue button-down shirt, and a charcoal sport coat that had hung largely unworn in his closet. The effect was deliberately neutral, neither emphasizing nor completely erasing his current role within the building. He arrived at the FBI building at 6:45 a.m., entering through the main entrance rather than the service access. Marjorie wasn't on duty at this early hour, replaced by a younger security officer who examined Thomas's temporary clearance documentation with careful attention. "You'll need to sign in here, Mr. Reeves," the officer instructed, pushing a visitor log toward him, "and I'll need to issue you a special access badge for the executive floor." Thomas completed the process with patient compliance, accepting the visitor badge and clipping it to his sport coat. The badge marked him immediately as something other than maintenance staff, a shift in identity that felt both foreign and strangely familiar, like rediscovering the muscle memory of a long-abandoned skill. The executive floor was quiet at this early hour, most senior officials not yet arrived for the day. Thomas located Hargrove's office easily, his years of maintaining the building having created a mental map far more detailed than any directory could provide. Section Chief Hargrove was already at his desk, reviewing documents with the focused intensity Thomas recognized from senior officers who had risen through merit rather than political connection. He looked up at Thomas's knock, rising to greet him with a firm handshake and a respectful nod. "Mr. Reeves, thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." Hargrove gestured to a chair positioned across from his desk. "Coffee?" "Thank you, no," Thomas replied, sitting with the straight-backed posture that had been drilled into him through decades of military service. Hargrove studied him briefly before speaking again. "I imagine this situation is somewhat unusual for you. Being invited to the executive floor rather than cleaning it?" "Yes, somewhat." The dry humor emerged unexpectedly, a glimpse of a personality Thomas rarely revealed in his current life. Hargrove smiled appreciatively. "I meant finding yourself back in the world of intelligence analysis after deliberately stepping away from it." Thomas nodded, acknowledging the more substantive point. "It wasn't part of my retirement plan, no. And yet, when presented with the opportunity to contribute, you did so with exceptional insight and without hesitation." Hargrove leaned forward slightly. "That suggests to me that while you left the operational side of this work, the fundamental commitment to the mission never entirely disappeared." The observation was uncomfortably perceptive, cutting through years of carefully constructed detachment to identify the core truth Thomas had only recently begun to acknowledge to himself. Rather than confirm or deny it directly, he shifted to practical matters. You mentioned occasional consultation, Thomas said. I'd like to understand exactly what you're proposing. Hargrove nodded, accepting the redirection. What I'm proposing is an informal arrangement, where we would occasionally, perhaps once monthly, perhaps less, seek your perspective on specific threat assessments, where your particular background and expertise would be valuable. No field operations, no direct involvement in investigations, simply analytical consultation under strictly confidential parameters. And my current position? Remains exactly as it is, Hargrove assured him. Your maintenance role provides excellent cover for your presence in the building, and there's no operational reason to change it unless you wish to. Thomas considered this, appreciating the practical logic while noting the spycraft terminology, cover, that Hargrove had slipped into the conversation, and compensation. We can arrange modest consulting fees through appropriate channels that wouldn't trigger attention from administrative review, nothing that would suggest more than occasional technical consultation. Hargrove paused. Though, I suspect compensation isn't your primary concern in this decision. Again, the perception was uncomfortably accurate. Thomas had accumulated modest savings through his military career and lived well below his means in retirement. Financial motivation had never been his primary driver, either in his former career or his current considerations. My concern is operational security, Thomas clarified. I've spent 7 years establishing a specific identity here. Sudden changes in my status, schedule, or apparent relationship with bureau leadership could compromise that carefully constructed position. Hargrove's expression reflected professional appreciation for Thomas's security mindset. Hence, the early morning meeting, the temporary credentials, and the commitment to maintaining your current role as the foundation of your presence here. We're entirely aligned on maintaining operational security around your involvement. Thomas nodded, satisfied with the response, but still weighing larger implications. And if I decline, then you remain our valued maintenance staff member, and we remain grateful for the one-time assistance you've already provided. Hargrove's answer came without hesitation. This isn't pressure, Mr. Reeves. It's recognition of an asset that could be mutually beneficial to employ, but only under terms acceptable to all parties. Indeed, the straightforward approach resonated with Thomas's own professional values. Throughout his operational career, he had appreciated clear parameters and honest assessments over bureaucratic maneuvering or emotional manipulation. I need to consider the implications, Thomas said finally. This would represent a significant shift from the boundaries I've established for myself. Of course, Hargrove agreed. Take whatever time you need. The offer remains open. He handed Thomas a secure phone, a simple flip model with enhanced encryption. If you decide to proceed, call the only number programmed into this. If not, simply leave it in your locker and I'll arrange for its retrieval. Thomas accepted the phone, tucking it into his inner jacket pocket without comment. He rose to leave, then paused. The Federal Reserve operation, was it completely neutralized? Hargrove's expression confirmed the seriousness of the averted threat. Completely. 8 arrests total now, including the insider threat you identified, a contract IT specialist with access to our personnel databases. The explosives recovered could have caused structural damage across a 3-block radius, with potential casualties in the hundreds. Thomas absorbed this information with the stoic acceptance of a man long accustomed to the realities of modern and terrorism, then nodded once. Good outcome, he said simply, echoing his earlier comment to Morrison. The best kind, Hargrove agreed, the kind no one ever knows about. Thomas left the executive floor and made his way out of the building. The temporary access badge turned in, his status reverting to that of a civilian departing the premises. Yet as he drove to his volunteer shift at the VA hospital, He was acutely aware of the secure phone in his pocket, a small physical embodiment of the choice now before him. The VA hospital operated in a different rhythm than the FBI building. Less urgent intensity, more steadfast endurance. Thomas had been volunteering in the physical rehabilitation wing for 3 years, using his own experiences with combat-related injuries to provide practical support and unspoken understanding to veterans, navigating the challenging path of recovery. "Morning, Tom," called Nurse Ramirez as he signed in at the volunteer desk. "We've got a new arrival I think you should meet. Marine, double amputee, 3 weeks out from his last surgery, not engaging well with the therapy program." Thomas nodded, accepting the assignment without question. The nursing staff had learned early on that he had a particular ability to connect with the most resistant patients, especially those struggling with the psychological dimensions of physical recovery. He found the Marine in the physical therapy room, seated in a wheelchair and staring with undisguised hostility at the parallel bars where he was supposedly scheduled to begin gait training with his new prosthetics. "Not happening today," the young man stated flatly as Thomas approached, clearly assuming he was another physical therapist coming to deliver motivational platitudes. Thomas studied him briefly. Early 20s, the hardened physique of a combat Marine now adjusting to profound physical change, anger masking fear in a pattern Thomas had seen countless times before, including in his own mirror years ago. "Wasn't going to suggest it," Thomas replied, pulling up a chair and sitting with the relaxed confidence of someone who belonged in the space. "I'm Tom. I volunteer here Fridays." The Marine's eyes flickered with reassessment, noting Thomas's direct approach and lack of clipboard or medical attire. "Jake Ellis, Staff Sergeant, or at least I was." "Still are," Thomas corrected mildly. "The Corps doesn't take back what you earned just because you're missing some original equipment." Ellis's expression shifted slightly, surprise replacing some of the defensive anger. "You serve?" Thomas nodded. "Army. Retired a while back." "Combat?" Ellis asked, the question carrying layers of meaning beyond its simple form. "Yes." "Oh." Thomas offered no details, but something in his tone communicated shared experience more effectively than any war story could have. Ellis studied him with the assessing gaze of a man accustomed to evaluating potential threats and allies. "How long you been doing this volunteer gig?" 3 years here. Did similar work at Walter Reed before moving to Philly. "Why?" The question was blunt, cutting through social niceties to the core motivation. Thomas considered his answer carefully, aware that his response might significantly impact this young Marine's receptiveness to future therapy. "Because I received similar help when I needed it, and because it matters." Ellis absorbed this, his expression guarded, but marginally more open. "They tell me I'll walk again, run even with the right prosthetics. You believe that optimistic bullshit?" "I believe you'll do whatever you decide is worth doing," Thomas replied. "The prosthetics, the physical therapy, those are just tools. The deciding factor has always been the operator, not the equipment." The deliberate use of operator terminology, language from special operations that distinguished elite forces from conventional military, wasn't lost on Ellis. His posture straightened almost imperceptibly, pride momentarily overriding self-pity. "Were you—" Ellis began, then hesitated, searching Thomas's impassive face for clues to his military background. "Does it matter?" Thomas countered gently. Ellis considered this, then shook his head slightly. "Guess not. Not in here anyway." "No," Thomas agreed. "In here, the only relevant question is what you're going to do next. What if I don't know the answer to that yet?" There was vulnerability beneath the question, the uncertainty of a young man whose identity and future had been fundamentally altered by war. "Then you focus on creating options," Thomas said simply. More capabilities mean more choices later. That's always been true in our line of work. The use of "our" created a small bridge between them, an acknowledgement of shared experience that transcended their different services, ages, and specific injuries. Ellis didn't immediately respond, but Thomas noted the subtle shift in his expression, calculation replacing resignation, the beginnings of strategic thinking applied to his own recovery. For the next hour, Thomas sat with Ellis, their conversation moving between practical rehabilitation strategies, dark humor about military medical care, and the occasional oblique reference to combat experiences that could be acknowledged without being explicitly described. No breakthrough moments, no dramatic commitments to embrace rehabilitation, but small incremental shifts in perspective that Thomas recognized as the essential foundation for lasting change. As their session ended, Ellis looked at Thomas with newfound respect. "You'll be here next Friday?" Thomas nodded. "Same time." "I might try the bars before then," Ellis said, the statement deliberately casual. "Just to shut up the therapists." "Your call," Thomas replied, matching his tone. "They work better if you approach them as tactical equipment rather than medical devices. Adapt and improvise, same as always." Ellis almost smiled, a brief flicker quickly suppressed. "Semper Fi," he said, the Marine Corps motto offered as both acknowledgement and farewell. "De oppresso liber," Thomas responded quietly, the Special Forces motto, to free the oppressed, revealing more about his military background than he had explicitly stated during their entire conversation. Ellis's eyes widened slightly in recognition before he nodded once, a gesture of profound respect from one elite warrior to another. As Thomas signed out at the volunteer desk, Nurse Ramirez approached with evident curiosity. "How'd it go with Ellis? He's been refusing to engage with anyone else." "He'll be ready for the parallel bars next week," Thomas replied with quiet certainty. "Maybe sooner." Ramirez shook her head in amazement. "I don't know how you do it, Tom. The difficult ones always respond to you." Thomas shrugged slightly. "Just speaking the same language." He left the VA hospital and drove, not to his apartment, but to a small park overlooking the Schuylkill River. Finding a bench with good sight lines and minimal exposure, the habitual security assessment never entirely abandoned, Thomas sat and removed the secure phone from his pocket. The interaction with Staff Sergeant Ellis had clarified something important, the value of specific experience, properly applied. Thomas had connected with the young Marine not because of medical training or rehabilitation expertise, but because he brought relevant lived experience to a situation where such perspective was both rare and essential. The parallel to Hargrove's consultation offer wasn't subtle. Thomas possessed specialized knowledge and experience that could provide valuable perspective in certain threat scenarios, perspective that might make critical differences in outcomes, potentially saving lives that would otherwise be lost. For 7 years, he had deliberately walled off that knowledge and experience, containing it within the boundaries of his carefully constructed new identity. The choice had been understandable at the time, a response to operational burnout, to the accumulated trauma of 2 decades in shadows most Americans never glimpsed, to the specific losses that had marked his final years of service. But sitting in the park, watching the river flow with its eternal forward momentum, Thomas recognized that his decision to disengage had been shaped more by emotional withdrawal than by reasoned assessment of how his hard-earned wisdom might still serve a purpose he had never actually abandoned. The question wasn't whether he possessed valuable insight. Morrison and Hargrove had already confirmed that beyond doubt. The question was whether he was willing to selectively re-engage, to carefully dismantle portions of the wall he had built between his past and present. Thomas considered the secure phone, turning it over in his hands, The decision wasn't just about occasional consultation on terrorist threats. It was about reconciling the two versions of himself that had been artificially separated: the quiet janitor, who moved invisibly through the FBI building, and the experienced operator whose insights could potentially prevent catastrophic attacks. Perhaps the true value lay not in fully embracing either identity, but in finding a calibrated integration that preserved what mattered from both: the peace and simplicity of his current life, alongside the purposeful application of his specialized knowledge where it could make the most difference. Thomas flipped open the phone and dialed the only programmed number. It rang twice before being answered. "Hargrove," came the crisp response. "This is Reeves," Thomas said, his voice steady with resolved certainty. "I'm in, with 3 conditions." "I'm listening," Hargrove replied. "First, my regular schedule remains unchanged. Maintenance shifts, VA volunteering, all of it. Consultations happen around those commitments, not instead of them." "Agreed." "Second, complete compartmentalization. Morrison and you are the only FBI personnel who know about this arrangement. No one else, regardless of clearance level." "That was already my intention," Hargrove confirmed. "Operational security is paramount." "Third," Thomas continued, "any consultation I provide focuses exclusively on threat assessment and strategic analysis. I don't design operations, I don't review tactical plans, and I don't evaluate specific personnel. My involvement ends at the analytical level." There was a brief pause before Hargrove responded. "Those terms are acceptable. When would you be available for an initial briefing on our current threat matrix?" "Monday, 7 a.m., Thomas replied. "Your office." "I'll make the arrangements," Hargrove said, professional satisfaction evident in his tone. "And Reeves, thank you." Thomas ended the call without further comment, slipping the phone back into his pocket. The decision made, he felt neither triumph nor regret, only the quiet certainty of alignment with purpose, the recognition that his value extended beyond the boundaries he had imposed upon himself. The river continued its flow beneath the spring sunshine, unchanging in its essential nature despite the obstacles and channels that shaped its course. Thomas watched it for several minutes more, reflecting on the parallel to his own journey. The core identity unchanged, despite the external transitions from operator to janitor, and now to this carefully calibrated middle ground. As he finally rose to leave, Thomas noticed a silver-haired man in a wheelchair being pushed along the riverside path by a younger woman, clearly his daughter from their shared features. The man wore a Vietnam-era Army veteran's cap, his weathered face turned toward the water with peaceful appreciation. Thomas nodded respectfully as they passed, a gesture automatically returned by the older veteran with the instant recognition that transcends generations of service. In that brief exchange lay another confirmation of his decision, the unspoken brotherhood that connected those who had stood in defense of others, regardless of when or where they had served. The tattoo on Thomas's forearm, the dagger piercing the Delta symbol with its 3 stars, remained hidden beneath his sleeve as he walked back to his jeep. But its presence felt different now, less a remnant of a discarded past and more a permanent marker of identity that encompassed both who he had been and who he continued to be. The janitor with the hidden tattoo would continue his rounds through the FBI building, invisible to most who passed him in the corridors. But now, that invisibility was a chosen tool rather than an imposed limitation, a tactical advantage that allowed him to serve in ways few would ever recognize, but whose impact might be measured in lives preserved and threats neutralized before they could materialize into tragedy. In finding this new equilibrium, Thomas Reeves had not abandoned the peace he had sought in retirement, but had enhanced it with renewed purpose. The recognition that his greatest value lay not in denying his past, but in selectively applying its lessons where they could make the most difference. 6 months transformed everything while changing nothing at all. Thomas Reeves still arrived at the Philadelphia FBI field office at precisely 4 p.m. Monday through Friday. He still navigated the building's 6 floors with his maintenance cart, changing light bulbs, emptying trash bins, and ensuring the bathrooms remained well stocked and spotless. His grey coveralls remained pressed to military precision, his employee badge clipped to the same spot on his left chest pocket. But beneath this unaltered exterior, a profound evolution had occurred, the careful reintegration of capabilities. Long dormant, the selective application of specialized knowledge where it could make the most difference, the measured re-engagement with a mission he had never truly abandoned. Twice monthly, Thomas arrived at the building at 7 a.m., entering through the main entrance rather than the service access, a visitor badge temporarily replacing his maintenance credentials. These early morning meetings with Section Chief Hargrove and Agent Morrison occurred in a secure conference room designated solely for sensitive consultations, all records of the gatherings maintained under classified protocols, accessible only to those with specific authorization. The arrangement had proven more valuable than even Hargrove had anticipated. Thomas's analyses of emerging threat patterns, his identification of operational signatures that traditional FBI methodology often missed, his ability to interpret fragmentary intelligence through the lens of decades of specialized experience, all had materially enhanced the Bureau's counterterrorism capabilities in ways that remained invisible but impactful. 3 significant threats had been neutralized during those 6 months, each intervention occurring so early in the planning cycle that the potential perpetrators never realized how thoroughly they had been compromised. No dramatic raids, no headlines, no public acknowledgement, just the quiet victory of prevention rather than response, the absence of tragedy representing the highest form of success. For Thomas, the careful calibration between his public role and classified contributions had created an unexpected harmony. The peaceful routine of his maintenance position balanced by the purposeful application of his specialized knowledge. Neither identity negating the other, but instead creating a synergy that felt increasingly natural. On this particular Friday, Thomas was completing his rounds on the 4th floor when Agent Morrison approached, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes conveying urgency. "Mr. Reeves," she greeted him with the formal address they maintained. "In public spaces, when you have a moment, there's an issue with the lighting in conference room 422 that needs your attention." Thomas nodded, understanding the coded message. Conference room 422 wasn't a maintenance priority. It was their designated secure meeting location. "I'll check it out right away," he replied, keeping his tone matter-of-fact for the benefit of any observers. Once inside the conference room, Morrison closed the door and verified the security protocols that prevented electronic surveillance, a standard precaution for all their interactions. "Hargrove needs you in his office immediately," she said, without preamble. "There's been a development that requires your specific expertise." Thomas raised an eyebrow slightly. This deviation from their established consultation schedule signaled something significant. "Now?" Morrison nodded. "I'll escort you to minimize questions. We'll use the executive elevator." 10 minutes later, Thomas sat across from Hargrove in the section chief's office, a classified file open between them. The atmosphere was tense, with controlled urgency, the kind Thomas recognized from operational briefings before high-risk deployments. 4 hours ago, we intercepted partial communications suggesting an imminent threat to a federal target in Philadelphia, Hargrove explained, his usual measured tone tightened by concern. The chatter has signatures similar to the cell you helped us identify 6 months ago, but with new players and evolved methodology. Thomas studied the intelligence summary, his mind automatically sorting relevant details and identifying patterns. "They're learning," he observed. "The communication security is more sophisticated, the language more disciplined. They've adapted based on the previous cell's compromise." "That's our assessment as well," Hargrove confirmed. "What concerns us is the timeline. Previous patterns suggested weeks of planning before execution. This indicates an operational window of less than 72 hours. Thomas continued analyzing the intelligence fragments, connecting elements that might seem unrelated to less experienced observers. "They're using a variant of the Beirut Protocol," he noted, referencing an operational security method developed by Hezbollah and later adopted by various terror organizations. "The sequencing of communications, the cutouts between operational teams, it's designed specifically to accelerate deployment while maintaining compartmentalization." Morrison leaned forward. "Can you identify potential targets based on these patterns?" Thomas considered the question, reviewing the fragmentary intelligence through the lens of tactical analysis honed across decades of counter-terrorism operations. "These aren't the indicators I'd expect for a Federal Reserve target or similar economic objective," he said finally. "The communications pattern suggests something different, a symbolic target with high human density rather than structural or economic impact." "A mass casualty event?" Hargrove asked, his expression grave. "Most likely," Thomas confirmed. "The emphasis on timing and crowd assessment in these fragments indicates they're prioritizing maximum human impact over infrastructure damage. The implications hung heavily in the air between them. Philadelphia contained numerous potential targets fitting that description: federal buildings with public access areas, transportation hubs, public gatherings in historical locations frequented by tourists and locals alike. "We've activated the Joint Terrorism Task Force," Hargrove said, "but without a specific target identified, we're spread thin across too many potential locations. We need to narrow the focus to allocate resources effectively." Thomas studied the intelligence fragments again, searching for indicators that might have been overlooked or misinterpreted. Something about the pattern tugged at his memory, an operational signature he had encountered before, not in theoretical training, but in direct field experience. "There's something familiar here," he said slowly. "This specific sequence of preparation and deployment. I've seen it before, but not from conventional terror cells." He closed his eyes briefly, accessing memories from operations long classified, connecting fragments across decades of experience that no database could replicate. When he opened them again, his expression had changed from analytical concentration to focused certainty. "The courthouse," he said with quiet conviction. "They're targeting the federal courthouse." Morrison and Hargrove exchanged glances, surprise evident in their expressions. "What makes you certain?" Morrison asked. "There's nothing specific in these communications that indicates judicial targets." "It's not what's in the communications, it's the structure of the operation itself," Thomas explained. "This pattern matches a methodology developed by a specific trainer who operated in northern Pakistan between 2007 and 2013. He specialized in teaching accelerated deployment against judicial targets, specifically because of their symbolic value, combined with relatively lower security compared to military or intelligence facilities." "You encountered this trainer's work before?" Hargrove asked, clearly recognizing that Thomas was speaking from direct operational experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Thomas nodded once, offering no details but conveying confirmation. "The methodology is distinctive once you know what to look for. The timing indicators, the specific sequence of pre-operational surveillance, the communications cutouts, they're all consistent with his training protocols." Hargrove didn't press for classified details that Thomas couldn't legally share. Instead, he focused on the immediate operational implications. The federal courthouse has a major trial concluding today, United States versus Parnell, International. Arms trafficking with terrorism enhancements, high-profile heavy media presence, increased civilian attendance. Perfect target profile, Thomas confirmed grimly. Symbolic justice system target, guaranteed media coverage, concentrated crowds, and the emergency response would disrupt federal operations across multiple agencies. Timeline? Morrison asked, already reaching for her secure phone. Based on these communications and the methodology they're employing, I'd expect execution within the next 12 to 24 hours, Thomas replied. Most likely timed to morning arrival or afternoon departure when civilian density is highest outside the security perimeters. Hargrove was already in motion, activating response protocols with the controlled urgency of a veteran field operator who had transitioned to leadership without losing his tactical edge. Morrison, coordinate with JTTF. I want surveillance teams on the courthouse perimeter within the hour. Plainclothes only, maximum discretion. Coordinate with courthouse security. But minimize information distribution. Need to know only until we have confirmation. Thomas rose to leave, his analytical contribution delivered and his role in the operational response undefined. Hargrove paused in his rapid-fire directives to address him directly. Reeves, I need you to remain available for consultation as this develops. Can you delay your VA commitment tomorrow morning, if necessary? The request represented a potential expansion of Thomas's carefully bounded consulting arrangement, edging closer to direct operational involvement rather than purely analytical contribution. He considered it briefly, weighing the established parameters against the potential consequences of disengagement. I can remain available, he confirmed, but my role stays advisory, not operational. Hargrove nodded, accepting the boundary. Understood. Return to your regular duties for now. Morrison will contact you through established channels if developments warrant further consultation. Thomas left the executive floor and returned to his maintenance cart, resuming his rounds with the same methodical attention he always demonstrated. To any observer, he remained the quiet janitor, focused on his assigned tasks, his brief absence from the floor unremarkable and unnoticed. Yet internally, his mind continued processing the intelligence, evaluating potential scenarios and response options, with the precision that had once made him an exceptional operational asset. The re-engagement of these analytical capabilities felt neither forced nor foreign, but instead like the natural application of hard-earned wisdom to a situation where it could make a critical difference. At midnight, Thomas completed his shift and signed out with the night security officer, Marjorie. Having departed hours earlier, he drove home through Philadelphia's quiet streets, his external routine preserved while his mind remained engaged with the potential threat unfolding against the backdrop of the city he now called home. In his apartment, Thomas bypassed his usual evening rituals and instead removed a secure laptop from a hidden compartment in his closet, equipment provided by Hargrove for classified communications related to his consulting role. The laptop connected through encrypted channels, requiring multiple authentication measures before displaying a simple message. Surveillance confirms unusual activity near courthouse perimeter. Tactical teams on standby. Briefing 0500. Thomas acknowledged receipt and closed the connection, setting an alarm for 4 a.m. before attempting to rest. Sleep came in the disciplined manner he had mastered during his operational years, the ability to secure necessary recovery while maintaining a level of awareness that would respond to any significant disturbance. At precisely 4 a.m., he woke, performed abbreviated morning exercises, and prepared himself with the focused efficiency that had once been standard operating procedure before critical missions. By 4:45, he was driving toward the FBI building, the pre-dawn streets empty except for delivery trucks and early shift workers. The briefing room contained a small group of senior agents, Hargrove, Morrison, and 3 others Thomas recognized as JTTF leadership from his maintenance rounds through their offices. All looked up as he entered, their expressions reflecting various degrees of surprise at the janitor's arrival in this classified operational context. Mr. Reeves will be providing subject matter expertise for this operation, Hargrove explained, simply establishing Thomas's presence without elaborate backstory or justification. His insights led to the courthouse focus, and his assessment has been validated by overnight surveillance. The JTTF agent's surprise transformed into professional interest as Hargrove continued the briefing, detailing the surveillance findings that confirmed unusual activity consistent with pre-operational preparations for an attack. 3 individuals, with behavioral indicators consistent with hostile surveillance, have been observed making multiple passes of the courthouse perimeter between 2100 and 0300 hours, Hargrove explained, displaying surveillance photos on the secure briefing screen. Subjects demonstrated counter-surveillance awareness, communication security, and tactical positioning assessment, consistent with trained operators rather than opportunistic extremists. Thomas studied the photographs, noting details that confirmed his earlier assessment: the specific pattern of perimeter evaluation, the timing intervals between passes, the deliberate positioning relative to security cameras and checkpoint locations. The methodology matched what he had encountered years earlier in operations that remained classified, the signature unmistakable to someone who had directly confronted its implementation. Based on the pattern observed, Thomas said, speaking, for the first time since the briefing began, they're likely planning for multiple, simultaneous entry points rather than a single breach point. The surveillance focus on both the main entrance and the service access suggests a coordinated approach designed to divide security response. The JTTF agents turned toward him with increased attention, their initial surprise at the janitor's presence now replaced by recognition of specific expertise. Timeline assessment? Asked the senior JTTF agent, a veteran counter-terrorism specialist named Rodriguez, whom Thomas recognized from years of cleaning his office. The surveillance pattern indicates final preparation, Thomas replied. Based on the methodology they're employing, execution would typically follow within 6 to 12 hours of this type of perimeter assessment, which puts us in the window of the morning arrival period for the Parnell trial conclusion, Morrison added. Approximately 0900 to 10:30, when attorneys, media, and public observers would be congregating outside the security checkpoints. The briefing continued with operational planning, surveillance deployments, tactical team positioning, coordination with courthouse security, and the delicate balance between adequate response readiness and avoiding actions that might alert the hostiles to detection. Throughout the discussion, Thomas contributed specific insights based on his knowledge of the operational methodology being employed, carefully avoiding reference to classified operations while providing critical context that shaped the response strategy. His contributions were precise and focused, delivered with the quiet authority that came from direct experience rather than theoretical knowledge. As the briefing concluded and assignments were distributed, Hargrove approached Thomas with a concerned expression. We've confirmed your assessment and developed a response plan accordingly. Your contribution has been invaluable, but I'm concerned about keeping you in the potential impact zone. Perhaps you should remain off-site until this is resolved. The suggestion was reasonable from both security and personal safety perspectives, yet Thomas found himself reluctant to disengage completely from an operation where his specialized knowledge might still prove critical. "I'll maintain my normal schedule," he decided. "My presence in the building as maintenance staff provides natural cover for continued availability if needed, without raising questions about special arrangements." Hargrove studied him briefly, recognizing the professional assessment beneath. "The personal choice. Understood. Morrison will be your point of contact if developments warrant further consultation." Thomas returned to his apartment briefly to change into his maintenance uniform before reporting for his regular shift at 4 p.m. The courthouse situation remained unresolved, surveillance teams monitoring continuing preparations without yet having sufficient evidence or identification to justify intervention. The tension of waiting was familiar to Thomas from countless operations across his military career. The disciplined patience required between intelligence acquisition and action. The narrow window where premature response could compromise the mission while delayed action could result in preventable casualties. As he went about his normal maintenance duties, Thomas maintained awareness of the operational dynamics unfolding across the city, receiving periodic updates through secure text messages from Morrison. The investigation had identified 5 suspected operatives, their movements under surveillance, while evidence was gathered to justify intervention. At 11:30 p.m., 30 minutes before the end of his shift, Thomas received an urgent message from Morrison. "Courthouse surveillance indicates accelerated timeline. Subjects positioning equipment for early morning operation. Tactical response authorized for 0500. The update was significant. The hostiles had advanced their preparations likely, positioning explosive devices or weapons caches for the morning attack. The FBI's tactical response was now scheduled for pre-dawn intervention, designed to neutralize the threat before the courthouse opened for the day's proceedings." Thomas acknowledged the update and continued his rounds, completing his shift with the same methodical thoroughness he always demonstrated. Yet, as he signed out at midnight and walked to his jeep in the nearly empty parking lot, he found himself conducting an automatic assessment of the operational plan based on the limited information available. The timing felt wrong. The accelerated preparations observed at the courthouse contradicted the established methodology he had identified. The operational signature he recognized typically maintained strict adherence to timeline protocols, with final positioning occurring much closer to execution, not hours in advance. As Thomas drove toward his apartment, the discrepancy continued to trouble him, triggering the instinctive, analytical response that had once been his professional hallmark. Why would operators trained in a specific methodology suddenly deviate from its established protocols? What had changed in the operational environment to warrant such adjustment? Halfway home, the answer crystallized with sudden clarity. They hadn't changed their timeline. They had changed their target. Thomas pulled into a vacant parking lot and removed his secure phone, dialing Morrison's direct number rather than sending a text message. She answered immediately, her voice tense with the focus of ongoing operations. "This is Morrison." "The courthouse isn't the target," Thomas said without preamble. "It's misdirection." There was a moment of stunned silence before Morrison responded. "We have confirmed surveillance showing equipment positioning at the courthouse location. Thermal imaging indicates device placement in progress." "It's a diversion," Thomas insisted, certainty hardening his voice. "The methodology I identified doesn't include early equipment positioning. It maintains strict timeline adherence with deployment immediately preceding execution. What you're observing is deliberately visible preparation, designed to draw security resources to the courthouse, while the actual operation targets a different location." "What's your basis for this assessment?" Morrison asked, professional. enough to consider the possibility, despite the operational momentum already directed toward the courthouse response. Pattern recognition and direct operational experience, Thomas replied, unwilling to elaborate further on classified aspects of his background. The deviation from established methodology is too significant to be accidental. It's deliberate misdirection. If not the courthouse, then what's the actual target? The question reflected Morrison's willingness to consider the alternative assessment, despite the evidence currently driving the operational response. Thomas considered the intelligence fragments he had reviewed, reassessing them in light of this new understanding. If the courthouse preparation was deliberate misdirection, then the actual target would need to fulfill the same criteria of symbolic value and civilian density while benefiting from security resources being diverted elsewhere. The answer came with sudden clarity. The FBI building itself, he said, the certainty in his voice unmistakable. It fits all target criteria: symbolic federal presence, public access areas with civilian density during morning arrival, and security resources currently being diverted to the courthouse response. Morrison's sharp intake of breath was audible through the connection. Our building? Are you certain? Check surveillance for the FBI building perimeter over the past 12 hours, Thomas directed. Look for the same indicators we identified. At the courthouse, but conducted with higher operational security, they'll be more careful with the actual target than with the diversion. Hold on, Morrison replied, and Thomas could hear her typing rapidly, accessing surveillance systems to verify his assessment. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Morrison returned, her voice tightly controlled, but unmistakably alarmed. Thermal imaging shows minimal activity around our perimeter, but a routine security camera sweep shows something concerning. A maintenance van parked in our auxiliary service lot for approximately 40 minutes at 2200 hours, then departing. Building services confirms no scheduled maintenance requiring vehicle access. That's it, Thomas confirmed grimly. The courthouse preparation is visible by design. The FBI building preparation was conducted with maximum operational security. Because it's the actual target, they're counting on our resources being committed to the courthouse response while they execute their primary operation here. I'll alert Hargrove immediately, Morrison responded, professional training maintaining her focus despite the personal implications of a threat to her own workplace. We'll need to redirect resources without alerting the hostiles that we've identified the deception. I'm returning to the building, Thomas decided, already starting his jeep. My presence won't trigger suspicion since I'm recognized as maintenance staff with legitimate access. Negative, Morrison countered immediately. You're a civilian consultant, not a tactical responder. Remain off-site until we've secured the location. Thomas respected her concern but had already made his decision. I know that building better than anyone, including blind spots in the security coverage and structural vulnerabilities that wouldn't appear in standard blueprints. That knowledge could be critical in locating and neutralizing devices before they can be detonated. The logic was irrefutable, even if it pushed beyond the established parameters of Thomas's consulting arrangement. After a brief hesitation, Morrison relented. Report to the service entrance in 20 minutes. I'll ensure security is briefed to expect you while maintaining operational security regarding the threat response. Thomas arrived at the FBI building to find a carefully controlled scene. No visible tactical teams or emergency vehicles that might alert the hostiles to detection, but a heightened security presence disguised as routine night shift activity. Morrison met him at the service entrance, her professional demeanor masking the tension evident in her eyes. Hargrove has redirected tactical assets from the courthouse response, maintaining minimum visible presence there to sustain the deception, she explained as they moved through the building's service corridors. K-9 units are conducting a sweep of public areas, focusing on potential device placement locations. Thomas nodded, his mind already mapping potential vulnerabilities based on his intimate knowledge of the building's structure and security coverage. The most likely placement would be near the main entrance security checkpoint. Maximum civilian density during morning arrival, structural impact that would compromise building integrity, and psychological effect of breaching FBI security perimeters. They proceeded to the Security Command Center, where Hargrove was coordinating the response with tactical team leaders and building security specialists. He looked up as Thomas entered, acknowledging him with a nod that conveyed both respect and concern for his presence in a potentially dangerous operation. "Reeves, thank you for returning. Your assessment has been corroborated by additional surveillance review showing multiple indicators of preparation focused on this building rather than the courthouse." Thomas moved immediately to the security camera displays, studying the footage. With the practiced eye of someone who had spent years evaluating potential breach points and structural vulnerabilities. "Show me the maintenance van footage again," he requested. The security officer replayed the video segment showing the unmarked van in the service lot, capturing a figure in maintenance coveralls similar to Thomas's own uniform, removing equipment. Cases from the vehicle and entering through the service access door. "Stop there," Thomas directed, pointing to a frame showing the figure's profile. "Enhance this section." The image zoomed and clarified, revealing details of the equipment being transported, what appeared to be standard maintenance tools and supply cases, but with subtle inconsistencies that registered immediately to Thomas's trained observation. "Those aren't standard maintenance cases," he noted. "The dimensions are similar to demolition equipment containers, modified to resemble maintenance supplies, and the subject's movement pattern shows tactical training, weight distribution, and awareness of camera positions that maintenance personnel wouldn't typically demonstrate." Hargrove leaned closer to the display, studying the details Thomas had identified. Where would they position devices for maximum effect? Thomas considered the building's structural vulnerabilities, mapping potential placement locations against his knowledge of foot traffic patterns during morning arrival periods. 3 primary locations, he concluded. The main lobby security, checkpoint for maximum civilian impact, the structural support column in the northeast service corridor for building integrity compromise, and the electrical control room to disable emergency systems and hamper evacuation. D. The tactical team leader, a veteran FBI operator with extensive counterterrorism experience, nodded in agreement with Thomas's assessment. "Those locations align with our vulnerability analysis. We've got teams moving into position to clear each area, maintaining minimal visible presence, to avoid alerting any observers." For the next 2 hours, Thomas provided detailed guidance on building layout and structural elements that wouldn't appear in standard blueprints, directing search teams through service corridors and maintenance access points he had utilized daily for 7 years. His knowledge proved invaluable, identifying concealment locations that standard search protocols might have overlooked. At 3:15 a.m., the first device was located, a sophisticated explosive package concealed within an electrical panel near the main security checkpoint, designed to blend with existing infrastructure until remote detonation. The placement confirmed Thomas's assessment of the target selection and tactical approach. By 4:30 a.m., 2 additional devices had been located and secured, one positioned precisely at the structural support column Thomas had identified, the other in a ventilation duct above the electrical control room. The placement pattern matched his prediction with remarkable precision, validating both his understanding of the hostile methodology and his assessment of the building's vulnerabilities. As the tactical teams worked to secure and neutralize the devices, Hargrove approached Thomas in the Security Command Center, his expression reflecting both relief at the averted threat and profound appreciation for the intervention that had made it possible. "Your assessment saved lives today," he said quietly, professional reserve unable to completely mask the emotion behind the acknowledgement. "Without your recognition of the diversion strategy, we would have committed our resources to the wrong location while this building was compromised." Thomas nodded, accepting the acknowledgement without false modesty. Pattern recognition and building knowledge, a useful combination in this particular circumstance. "More than useful," Hargrove countered, "essential, and far beyond what our standard consulting arrangement anticipated." The implied question hung between them, whether Thomas's limited engagement had evolved into something more substantive than originally defined, and what that might mean for future operations. Before Thomas could respond, Morrison joined them, her expression reflecting the controlled aftermath of averted crisis. "Tactical teams have neutralized all 3 devices. Technical analysis confirms sophisticated construction with remote detonation capability. Preliminary assessment suggests potential casualties would have exceeded 200 if detonated during peak morning arrival." The scale of the averted tragedy settled over them, the lives preserved, the families spared unimaginable loss, the continuity of operations maintained for an essential federal agency. All made possible by the recognition of a specific operational pattern by a man most in the building still perceived only as the quiet janitor who emptied their trash bins and changed their light bulbs. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, his focus practical rather than philosophical. "Surveillance teams have identified the hostiles," Morrison replied. "Arrests are being coordinated with minimal visibility to preserve operational security. The courthouse diversion team is already in custody. Official narrative will attribute the intervention to standard security protocols and anonymous intelligence tips." Thomas nodded, appreciating the operational security that would preserve both the specific methodologies employed and his own anonymity within the building. "Then my involvement is concluded. I should prepare for my regular shift." Hargrove studied him with newfound respect, not just for his analytical contributions, but for his commitment to maintaining the careful balance between his specialized knowledge and his chosen daily role. "Your shift doesn't start for 12 hours, Hargrove pointed out. "You should rest after this operation." Thomas considered this briefly before shaking his head. "I'll maintain normal schedule. Deviations create questions that are best avoided." As he turned to leave, Hargrove spoke again, his tone reflective. "You know, most people with your background and capabilities would have insisted on recognition, on a role more aligned with their expertise than maintaining floors and changing light bulbs." Thomas paused, considering the observation. "The work I do now has its own value," he replied simply. "Different from my former role, but no less necessary. The building needs both clean floors and threat assessment. I'm fortunate to be able to provide both." The statement captured the essence of what Thomas had discovered over the past 6 months, that value wasn't defined by title or visibility, but by contribution, that purpose could be found in both the ordinary maintenance that kept systems functioning and the specialized intervention that prevented catastrophe. As dawn broke over Philadelphia, Thomas Reeves left the FBI building, driving home for a few hours of rest before returning for his regular shift. To most who would pass him in the corridors later that day, he would remain simply the quiet janitor, who moved efficiently through his tasks, invisible in his familiarity. But to the few who knew the truth, who had witnessed the precise application of specialized knowledge that had saved countless lives, he represented something profound, the recognition that true value often existed beyond visible credentials. that wisdom earned through experience could find purpose in unexpected contexts, and that sometimes the most impactful contributions came from those least seeking recognition for their efforts. The tattoo that had first revealed his hidden identity, the dagger piercing the Delta symbol with its 3 stars, remained concealed beneath his uniform sleeve as he completed his maintenance rounds that evening. Yet it no longer represented a past he had abandoned, but instead a foundation that continued to inform his present, a reminder that identity wasn't limited to external roles, but encompassed the complete integration of experience, wisdom, and purpose. In the quiet dignity of necessary work, whatever form it took, Thomas Reeves had found not just peace, but renewed purpose, the recognition that sometimes the most meaningful service happened not in the spotlight of public acknowledgement, but in the shadows of quiet competence, where actions spoke louder than titles and impact mattered more than recognition. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.